I'm George Riley, public water now. See what I am, managing director. But it seemed like it's a child of mine. You know, I don't. You remember, you forget their names, but you remember what it's all about. I guess you get mad at it. I don't know. Let's not go there. We have a few new handouts which are out there, and I want to encourage people to take them with them, assuming you might support what we're up to. This is the one that's Food and Water Watch that said we're #1 in the country. We have many, many copies of this. We hope you can take some with you and hand them out at work, or your friends or neighbors or next door, bridge club or garden club, or kids or whoever you're around. We do want to spread the word as much as we can, because we're going to be starting collecting signatures shortly in October. We're planning on being on the ballot in November of 2018. Most of this is not news to you. Most of you have already heard this. So we're going to be collecting signatures from October through April, and we're going to turn those signatures into the Water Management District, and then they will make a decision whether they go forward with what we're proposing or whether they go to the election. The assumption is it's going to go to the election. We're making the assumption it's going to go to the election, the November election. There is a June election, which is the partisan primary for all the state and state offices, Congress, but senator, and of course the governor and so on. And that's in June. But there are no local elections that I know of in June. But in November, where we're planning to have our ballot measure on, all the mayors will be running for that in that election. Not June, but in November. All the mayors will be running. Half the city councils will be running. And we're expecting that the question that we will ask, a simple question, is regarding public ownership. Do you want your money to stay local, or would you like sending it to New Jersey? And we think that's a simple question that we could ask, and we think we'll get the right answer. But this is kind of key to getting the word out. So we hope that you will take some and hand them out. Also, we have some new bumper stickers. Hope you'll take some of those too and hand them out. Now, I want to say one thing about another handout, which is also out there. And this was new. This is all new just this week ago. Not the Food and Water Watch #1. That's been out now for a few weeks. This chart is a list of local jurisdictions that have water in our area, provide water in our area. I forget which they are, but let's see. Marina Coast is here. Cal Water in Salinas, which is a corporate water company. This is their rates in Salinas. This is our rates, corporate water on the Peninsula. This is the difference. It's from $75 to $250. Felton is here. Felton bought their corporate water, Cal-Am. They bought out their Cal-Am system about 10 years ago. And what's not known here, what's not shown here, and we need to make a little modification on this chart, is that there will be another $50, not $45, added to this cost because they bought their system and they have to pay for it. Now, it's not a water cost, it's a purchase of the system cost. And they put this on the property tax bill. So it's not on a water bill. So this is a water bill cost. This is a true configuration of the water bill comparisons. But for purposes of just trying to be fully transparent, but also to help people understand things, Felton bought their system, and their cost is, they have to pay their cost. It adds about $50 to what their costs are for the whole, but not water, but for buying the system. But just notice, if their system goes this high on where my finger is, they're not only getting water, they're buying their system at this cost. Cal-Am is still here, just water today. And the Cal-Am costs do not include the new rate increase they're trying to get right now. The cost of capital, they're trying to get their profit piece increased. There's nothing in here about Pure Water Monterey, the project that has been approved, that's coming our way, new water supply. Not in here. Not in here, site wells. Not in here, the pipelines that are being built between Seaside and City Grove. Not in here, there's a the desal project. We have a cost here that's enormous, and it doesn't include any of the costs that's coming for the infrastructure improvements for water supply. So we're going to go off the charts. And it's one reason why we are so anxious to get this thing on the ballot and get people to have an opportunity to do something about this, because we do have an opportunity to do something about this.
Why not show those costs?
I hope to. We're going to modify the chart.
Okay.
I'm trying to put that. Oh, you're talking about the cost of
Infrastructure
infrastructure?
costs that aren't shown for Monterey.
Good question. We'll have to go to the. We just have to, you know.
We can use two colors. We can
Increase the paper size.
use two tones, one for the hard costs and one for the soft costs.
We will look at that. Well, that's a good idea. I appreciate that. So now let me go to the presentation tonight. I'm sorry.
Can I interrupt you just a minute?
Yes.
Okay. It's about RSVP.
Yes.
When you get an email from Public Water Now and you read where it is, what it is, all this sort of thing, and you scan down the page, toward the end, it should have a little rectangle, blue, that says, I want to attend. If you don't want to attend, you just ignore that. But if you do plan to come, and later plans change, that doesn't matter. But if you click on that, then you can enter your name, and I don't have to put your name in for the whole group that shows up. But that's where you RSVP. A lot of people say they don't see that blue rectangle at the bottom, but you have to scan way down. It's way at the bottom, and it's a little blue rectangle, and it just says, I want to attend, and if you click on it, then you are there as an RSVP, and all I have to do is just click a box in front that you have attended, and it just makes my life faster than entering everybody's name that I did for 1:30 today. There were 39 people here, and about 10 of them had signed in, the rest I had to enter. It just takes silly time that I could spend doing something else. I want those of you who have not signed up to volunteer in any way and feel inspired, there are 2 clipboards out there, and they have sheets like this on them. All I need is your name and your email, etc. And there's a list of possible jobs that you might be interested in doing. If so, we'd love to have you sign up. I'm treasurer, and I also lead the petition drive when it comes around. We have donation envelopes out there that have a card inside that people can write information on. If you know of anybody who might be willing to donate money, take some of these and hand them out to people. And George has already covered bumper stickers. We can actually see these. I put one on the car today and it looks great. So I think that's all I have to say.
Well, Dawn,
I'm trying to train people to RSVP. Roger Dolan is an engineer. He says, we engineers are very good at this. I said, so it's the liberal arts people that are getting it at that time, I'm guessing. So anyway, if you happen to think about it, you plan to come, you go down to the bottom, and you just click on it and put your name in, it's really a big help.
Well, I want to put in a plug on volunteers, because this is a pretty massive ground game we have ahead of us. And we're going to try to get about 15,000 signatures. Last time we gathered about 8. What we're trying to do is make a very convincing showing that the community wants this, and that's the best way we can make a showing to the Water Management District that they should go forward with it. So what we need to do is get as many people who are willing to volunteer, spend some time. You don't have to, it's not committing your life to this for the next 6 months. Well, you do need to commit some time, and we do need the time. We really do, even if it's only a small number of signatures. But we want as many people as possible who are willing to carry petitions with them and keep promoting it among their friends and neighbors, and strangers too, because a lot of this is with strangers, total strangers. So we really do need the help, and hope you will consider signing up in some fashion. But we're going to need a lot of help, and we'll be asking. Thank you, Gene. Back when Measure O lost, we were vulnerable in a couple of areas of not having had much information for the public and not having been adequately informed ourselves on what we were talking about. We were kind of attacked for not understanding eminent domain, and we just really didn't have much of a campaign on these issues. So knowing that, we've intentionally tried to schedule a public discussion of some of these three areas where we have been weak in the past, but as much as we're trying to learn, we want you to learn too. So we're putting as much of this stuff out into the public as possible. This is not just residential and not just our supporters, but the business community and others. We had a pretty wide notice of these past couple of meetings, and we scheduled afternoon sessions in order to make it even more convenient for people to show up either this afternoon or tonight. We had a good crowd this afternoon, by the way. But those three categories were eminent domain, and we had Missoula, Montana representatives here just a month or so ago, 6 weeks ago, just talking about eminent domain. So we feel like we were presenting to the public a better picture of what is eminent domain all about. It's not a secret, it's not a mystery, and yet it's a fear tactic that's used by the other side. So we're trying to prevent the fear, we're trying to take the mystique out of it and present it. And the second issue is bond financing. It's kind of arcane to a lot of people, but that's what we're talking about tonight. The third issue is the feasibility study in general. We have somebody coming from Ojai who did, next month, who did 2 different versions of a feasibility study for that community. That community is well on the way toward acquiring their corporate water services. It happens to be Golden Gates, not Cal-Am, but it's the same issue, same subject about eminent domain and financing. But the feasibility question is what we're going to emphasize next time. But tonight, it's bond financing. And what we have here is, who we have here is Roy Nelson. I'm going to have him kind of give you a little background of his experience, but we had a very good session this afternoon. I hope tonight is as lively as that one was. Thank you. And
Thanks, George. Hopefully I won't get too robotic here. This is my third of these presentations today, so bear with me. Way in background, as George said, my name is Roy Nelson. I work for a firm by the name of Wulff, Hansen and Company. We are located in San Francisco. We are a full-service public finance stock brokerage firm. We started in business in 1934, so we've been around a few more years than I've actually worked there. Through good times and bad times, seen just about everything. And we do everything from public finance work to stocks and bonds for individuals. So full service. Personally, I've spent about 36 years in the public finance sector, working with states, counties, cities, special districts, all the way down to an expertise I developed in healthcare finance, particularly for primary care, health clinics, and small substance abuse or mental health facilities. So I've done a lot of different things throughout my career, and I welcome the opportunity to at least give you a little insight into bond financing out there, and hopefully you all picked up a copy as a little presentation. Some of it is interesting. If you suffer from insomnia, take it to bed with you, it'll cure that. You'll be asleep in a few minutes. It is very detailed in terms of virtually every type of bond there is out in the marketplace. A lot of them are not germane to this project, but I at least wanted you to see them, if for no other reason, when your stockbroker or investment advisor calls you and says, hey, I think you ought to invest in assessment bonds for whatever, rather than appearing like you have no idea what he's talking about. You can at least flip to assessment bonds and have an idea what is covered. So it'll help you in a number of ways. In terms of this project, let me start out by explaining. A bond is nothing more than a loan made to a public entity. It's to finance equipment, it's to finance capital improvements. There are certain bonds that can be used to finance services, but they have been around forever, or virtually forever. The nice thing about bonds for public entities is that the people that invest in them, the interest they receive is exempt from both state and federal income tax. If you happen to live in a city such as New York City, they are also exempt from city income taxes. So they carry the lowest possible financing rate compared to debt that private companies issue or loans that individuals can get. By example, if bonds were to be issued by a public agency such as the Water Management Board to acquire the assets of CalAm, the water distribution system, and that was to be financed over 30 years, much like you finance a house, you're probably looking in today's market of something in the 3 3/4% range. By contrast, if it was a for-profit company to do it, it's probably 1% higher, 4 3/4, 5%. If you're internally financing it, such as I suspect CalAm is, maybe your borrowing cost on paper is 6%, so you can over-justify some of the rates and get a little more profit to the parent company. That often happens. I don't want to stand up here and say that I know CalAm is doing that, but that is not an unusual situation in corporate finance. And for illustrative purposes only, don't take me at heart. I haven't gone out and figured out what the system is worth or anything like that. But if we were to assume that maybe purchasing the assets costs $250 million in today's market, you're probably looking at $12 to $15 million a year in annual debt service on that type of loan. To put it another way, if there's 39,000 meters or users, that's roughly $6,410 per meter that you'd be looking at and costing each person. Breaking it down a little further, it's probably $360 a year or $30 a month. Just using ballpark numbers. That's not to say it wouldn't come in at 200 million or it wouldn't come in at 150 or 300 million, but at least it gives you an idea. George was kind enough to furnish me some public available information on CalAm's project. Looking at,
Are these all fixed rates?
yes, they would be fixed rate. Looking at CalAm's numbers or financials that they file with the CPUC, in their numbers is roughly $20 million comprised of corporate profit or corporate taxes that would not be paid by a governmental entity. So in other words, if you think, given today's rates for your water, there's about $20 million that is going to CalAm or their parent that would not be going to a public entity, because a public entity does not make a profit. So, if debt service to acquire their system was 12 to 15 million, that would leave about $5 million in ballpark that could be applied to deferred maintenance each year, or more likely used to reduce water rates. If you used it to reduce water rates, I think given what you all are paying right now, that's probably 6-8% reduction. I think you're paying about $1,200 a year or something. So a little bit of savings, but that gives you a little bit of ballpark. Plus you've got to assume that over the years, CalAm's cost will be higher than a public agency's cost. So in terms of how does a public agency go about acquiring a public agency acquiring a private water system? You know, it is generally done through eminent domain, because often the private company is not eager to sell the asset, so there's a little bit of battle there. You know, you have to determine the value, so the public agency will get an appraiser. The private company will get an appraiser. They will differ. The court will probably decide to retain a third appraiser, and somehow the court will decide a value. You know, they'll look at whatever method they choose to look at to put a value. Once that number has been decided, then the public agency can go out to the market and raise money to buy the project. The most typical way a public agency raises money is through bonds. There are really three options, viable options, that would apply to this project. One is the use of general obligation bonds. General obligation bonds are voter-approved bonds. They require a 2/3 majority vote. There is a lien or an allocation placed on each, let's call it house or meter because it's easier. And then the money for that is collected as part of the property taxes. So it's simply, those of you that have looked closely at your property tax bill, there's a county amount for the property taxes, and then there's a whole bunch of other groups that are collecting money for various bond issues or fees or assessments. It just becomes another line item. Those are the most secure for the investors, and those carry the lowest interest rate. Again, fixed rate, 20, 30, 40-year type of term, depending on the economics and what the citizens like in terms of how much to levy. Probably a more realistic approach in this environment is the use of what we call revenue bonds. Revenue bonds, the source of repayment comes from the actual project itself. So the Water Management Board would agree to set rates, water rates, at a level that would not only provide the maintenance and operation for the system, but also raise enough money to service the bonds or the debt that is borrowed to pay it off. That does not require a vote of the public, although it does require a public hearing and a rate setting by the water board. So obviously there would be public hearing and public input before a decision is made. The third methodology is, and let me back up 1 second to revenue bonds. In this environment or in this location and for this project, revenue bonds are going to be darn close in cost to general obligation bonds. And the reason I say that is you have an established water system, you're not building a new system where you're speculating what the revenue is. You are in a very favorable location. You know, the Monterey Peninsula is a sexy name, as we like to say in the marketplace. You know, people turn on their TV and see the AT&T golf tournament and all the wonderful pictures and everything. They're well familiar with the Monterey Peninsula. Not that there is anything wrong with Coalinga and Fireball and all of that, but it's not Monterey and Pacific Road, Pebble Beach, and all of that. So, you know, it's pretty well, would be pretty well received in today's market. Much like we do a lot of work with Marin County up in the Bay Area, and it's the same sort of thought there. A lot of affluent community, a lot of good publicity. The third method of financing is a vehicle called certificates of participation. It is the least secured for the investor because not only is there no voter approval, it again is revenue based, but it is subject to annual appropriation of a lease payment by the water board. So they could decide not to make payments, in which case the investors would then own the water system. Certificates of participation was really developed by municipal entities as a way to circumvent Proposition 13. Back when Prop 13 passed, it mandated a vote, a 2/3 vote, for either new taxes or new fees for services. Prop 13, and that had to do with long-term debt. Because certificates of participation are technically an annually renewable obligation, they don't constitute a long-term debt, and therefore they don't require a vote. So if you think of bonds being maybe at 375, general obligation bonds, 3.75%, revenue bonds might be at 3.90%, you know, maybe certificates of participation are 4.15%, something like that. So you can see there's a little bit of spread to them. One second, we have a question.
Does the Public Utility Commission play any role in approval of the?
Yes and no. There will likely be some CPUC approval in terms of the conversion from private to public. Once that happens, there is no more involvement. In other words, all rates and all governing of the water system is done by the local water board. It's no longer done by the CPUC. So that is removed from the equation. And that is good because the local water board is more responsive to the local community because, you know, they're either voted on or appointed by local jurisdictions. So, you know, if you don't like what they're doing, you 5,000 of you show up in red shirts and tell them you're not happy.
Yeah, I think you just answered my question because I was wanting to know what was the water board. It isn't the CPUC, it's the...
No, it's the local, you know, it can be any governmental entity. It could be a city, it could be the county, it could be the, you know, help me on the name, I think it's the
Monterey Peninsula Water Management District.
there we go. So,
It
you know,
exists.
which is existing, you know, and so that would likely be the appropriate vehicle because their boundaries almost are exactly the same as the Cal-Am service area. So that would be the entity that would issue the debt and run the system. So obviously, you know, there's going to be a protracted litigation period because I'm sure Cal-Am is not going to go, oh great, yes, buy the system. Whatever you want to pay us is good. Well, you know, they're gonna fight tooth and nail because to them it's a profit center. You know, they're obviously, you know, you guys are paying among the highest, if not the highest water rates in the country. You know, there's a reason for that, and it's not that, you know, Cal-Am's costs are that much higher than anywhere else. You know, they're seeing a sizable profit from this, so you know they're going to not want to give that up. But the whole purpose of eminent domain is for the public benefit or the public good. You know, it can be a project that is blight. You know, somebody just no longer maintains property or area, or it can be a situation where there is a public benefit to a water system becoming public as opposed to private. So there are, excuse me, all kinds of public benefits in this case, not the least of which is ideally a lower cost of water to the citizens. The other nice thing about a public entity doing bond issues is whether it's a 20, 25, 30, 40-year financing term, at the end of that period, that $12, $15 million of debt service goes away. So while there may be some increased maintenance costs, there may be some replacement costs, you know, there is a windfall to be had, you know, maybe not for the next generation, but certainly the following one in terms of significantly or potentially significantly lower cost of water. I will caveat this by saying, and this is unique to your situation, this is not common when it comes to water system bonds. You have a supply problem that other jurisdictions and entities do not. You know, no, I have not studied the groundwater, no, I have not looked at it, but from what I understand, there is not probably 30 years of available groundwater to tap into to distribute, which means there's going to need to be a water supply project done in conjunction with the acquisition of the system, because we're going to need to demonstrate to investors that if we're going to finance this acquisition over 30 years, there's going to be water to sell 30 years from now. You know, I would suspect the two most logical vehicles are either some sort of desalination project or a water reclamation project. I know there are some desalination projects in the works. You know, I'm not going to talk to which methodology is better or which is more cost effective or whatever. That's not my area of expertise. If there's a project to be financed, I can finance it, but I'm not going to determine which is better. Suffice to say that the water supply problem is true whether the system remains with CalAm or becomes, you know, part of the water management board. So whatever the cost of that project is will add to the rates you're paying right now for water. You know, so by illustrative example, if a desalination project costs $250 million, you know, we know it is roughly, you know, $120, you know, $360 a year for debt service, you know, so you're going to have an additional $30 a month for your water bill. But you're going to have that regardless what happens. CalAm would pass it along to you, the water board would pass it along to you. It is logical to assume the cost with the private entity will be higher than the cost to the public entity because their cost of borrowing is higher, they build in a profit, a return on investment, all kinds of things that public entities do not have. So you would assume it would be better to do it as a public entity.
I want to suggest that if there are questions on this point, please ask them, because it also ties into the CDO. The CDO requires some kind of action on water supply. If either CalAm or the public agency has to include in the financing going forward a supply project, what you're suggesting is that either one has to deal with the CDO issue. Either one has to deal with the supply issue. And so if you have any question about it, please ask them or be satisfied that you have a picture on that. Because I mean, I'm not saying you're the expert, but to the extent that you can answer those kind of questions.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to speak to a specific situation, but I can certainly tell you based on, you know, 35 years of knowledge, logical assumptions or general assumptions. You know, I don't want, you know, 2 days from now to read Roy Nelson from Wulff Hansen said that. You know, it's going to cost everybody X amount of dollars to build a desalination plant. But go ahead, you had a question first, and then we'll.
If the bonds are revenue bonds, will the cost of servicing those bonds be less than or more than the margin of profit that CalAm is taking? That is,
it should be less than when you look at the combination of profit and taxes that CalAm pays by virtue of being a for-profit company. So the assumptions that we are using, at least now, obviously as this progresses they'll be refined, is that number is about $20 million. So if you think of servicing the debt being in the $12 to $15 million range, the differential or the savings is about $5 to $8 million a year.
well, I think that's the biggest selling point that we should emphasize.
Yeah, that clearly one of the reasons we're doing this, you know, is that ideally there are two reasons. There is a cost benefit to the citizens, and it places control in the local population as opposed to some innocuous corporate entity somewhere in the world. got the next question.
I think I'm confused. When
That's
you were
fine.
talking,
I do that a lot to people.
when you were talking earlier, I think you said that a guess of like $250 million would be the cost of buying out Cal-Am
Yes.
and taking over control of that system.
Correct.
But then you said that in 30 years, we may not have any water to distribute. So what would the bond cover? Would that cover the cost of the additional source?
No, the 250 million we're talking about, or that I use for illustrative purposes, is the existing water distribution system and assets of Cal-Am right now. There will need to be a water supply project done as part of this, either by Cal-Am or by the Water Management Board. That will be separate from, same way, it will be financed with revenue bonds. If it's the public entity, it will be financed with revenue bonds, which will be done, sold just like the bonds that are used to acquire the system. If it's done by Cal-Am, it will be internally financed by them at a higher cost and then passed along in rates.
So when we're going door to door though with our petitions and people say, how much is this going to cost? An honest answer will have to include the cost of buying the system and financing a source of water?
I would not, because it will complicate them. I would initially say that if it was me, that, you know, this bond issue is determined to determine whether or not the water system on the peninsula should be publicly owned as opposed to privately owned. And with it, local control as opposed to corporate control. And as a result of public ownership, the cost of water should be less by approximately, you know, whatever, as we go through this, determine is a reasonable number to represent. That's the argument. The secondary argument, once the approval to acquire the project is, as a prudent entity, how do we guarantee to investors that there will be water for 30 years? That's an entirely different argument for people, because that argument applies whether ownership remains with Cal-Am or ownership becomes a public entity. Where the initial vote is, should we convert from private to public ownership? You don't want to be, and the reason I say that is you don't want to be out there saying, you're going to have to pay $360 a year to acquire the Cal-Am project. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have to pay another $360 a year for a water source. When Cal-Am is going to say, oh, no. Don't worry about a water source, we got it covered. You know, whether, you know, there's no reason for facts to get in the middle of this when Cal-Am is making representation, you know, but I can hear the argument now. So you don't want to take apples to apples, which apply to both public and private ownership, and add it on top of the oranges you're trying to sell as to whether this should be public or private ownership in terms of the water system. Personally, that's how I would do it. Yeah.
I'm just going to ask about surcharges. Right now, I think fully half of our bill, because we hardly water at all, is surcharges. I'm assuming if and when whoever buys the system or Cal-Am keeps it, when the $250 million it takes to find a new source, it's just going to be added to a new surcharge. So instead of, right now we pay about half our bill is surcharge, the rest of it's water usage plus basic service charge. When the time comes to buy this extra water source, it's just going to be twice as much.
Yeah, and that's what I said, it's going to be the same additional cost, whether it's Cal-Am or whether it's...
But is there a benefit when you go to public, would that surcharge go away, some of that stuff that we're paying them for being too good at conservation?
Potentially some could. I mean, remember the they're still going to have to generate enough revenue from water sales to service the debt and operate the system. So, I think before we get there, no? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, you mentioned the two main sources, reclamation, desalination, but there could be other sources, like for instance, with another water district exchanging water by means of pipelines, and any of these other sources, I think we'd be ahead to be a public agency dealing with another public agency rather than dealing with a profit.
You could, and given where you are, I don't know how viable that is because of the piping system. I will tell you from a personal standpoint, I used to live in a city, San Ramon, which is in the East Bay. It happens to be Chevron's world headquarters and AT&T Northern California headquarters. San Ramon at the time had a daytime population of roughly a resident population of roughly 25,000 and a daytime working population of 40,000, which gives you some idea of the industrial park that we had in San Ramon. They opted, and developers came to them to develop the next valley over, Doherty Valley, also known as Windermere Ranch, which was going to take the population from 25,000 to 40,000. Water was to be provided by the Dublin-San Ramon Services District, who said to the developers, we don't have the water. We do not have water for that many homes. You want to build homes? Go find water. They found a Native American tribe by Bakersfield that had water rights that they were able to purchase, transfer to Dublin San Ramon Services District, which then allowed them to approve the housing project and provide the water. That is always an option. I don't know how complicated that is, so I didn't want to sit here and say, yes, you can go find an agency, particularly given the way water is now in the state. So.
Yeah, getting back to the surcharges idea, my understanding is like the lion's share, maybe all of it, would be rolled into the purchase price. And once again, if you're going door to door, the idea of deconstructing San Clemente Dam, all the different surcharges that are there for all various reasons, we would be buying all of that, right? All of that debt service.
Yeah, I mean,
therefore, going door to door, we should be able to say, probably all of these surcharges will go away. And
I haven't looked at them all, so I don't want to go yes.
Right,
but conceptually,
right. It's all going to be one fund to pay for all of it.
Yeah.
And then secondarily, it's not quite apples to apples when you're talking about the new infrastructure because public financing is a whole lot cheaper than private thing. So anything we're going to build, that's going to be real expensive, but we should be able to finance it for less.
Correct. But I didn't want to I don't think it's a good idea to muddy the discussion of should the water distribution system be public or private with, and by the way, we also have to find a new source of water, because it opens yourself up to a counter argument by Cal-Am saying, all right, we got that covered, don't worry about it. Yeah. She had a question.
Yeah, this may not be in the scope of your talk, but...
Well, I'll make up an answer.
Okay. In terms of the assets that you're going to be purchasing,
yes.
What does that include? All of the liabilities, say lawsuits against Cal-Am, or what are they? Is this going to be determined in the court?
Yeah, generally in general corporate finance, I'll take off my public finance and put on my corporate finance. When there is a purchase or an acquisition, often you are buying assets only, and you exclude liabilities and known lawsuits, from the purchase. That's something that ultimately would be determined by the court and ultimately would factor into, potentially the value of the assets when you look at the, potential litigation or exposure that could be on them.
Maybe I'm jumping ahead to your conclusion, but will the bonds be available for purchase by retail investors? If I wanted to buy a bond, for example, how would I go about it?
Most likely, yes. And the reason I say that is, to give you back before the financial meltdown, that we all love so much when our home values drop, it used to be that there were what are known as bond underwriters. And bond underwriters came into a community or a project and said, let me finance your project. And they would work with the local entity to develop the cost and the financing structure and then ultimately sell those bonds to institutional investors, to money managers, and what I like to call widows and orphans, individual investors. They're denominated in $5,000 denominations normally, so there is opportunity often for local participation. But what happened was both the SEC and the Municipal Security Rulemaking Board figured out there's an inherent conflict here. You have an underwriter that is going to the community and saying, let me structure and finance your project. I'll get you the best deal out there. Then they're putting on their hat as a seller of the bonds, saying to the investors, I'll get you the highest return on your money that I can get you. There's a conflict there. You cannot serve two masters. So what they did was they limited what underwriters can do now. And they created what are known as a category called municipal advisors. My firm is both. I personally happen to concentrate more on municipal advice than I do on selling bonds because I don't like to pick up the phone and call Franklin Fund, or I don't have a whole bunch of individuals that have millions of dollars and want to invest. So what happened is, and it's a Chinese wall, you cannot be municipal advisor and underwriter on the same project. So there's not that conflict. As a municipal advisor, I come in and I work with a community or an entity to identify the project, look at all of the financing options, make recommendations as to what may be the best method of financing, and then work with them to determine whether we want to bring in an underwriter to sell the bonds, or maybe sell the bonds at competitive sale where you put it out to the universe and on a specific day get sealed bids. As a municipal advisor, I have a fiduciary duty to the public entity and to its constituents. So my job is solely to get the best deal possible for the public entity. The underwriter still is going to sell the bonds. He's going to still try and get the highest interest rate he can for his investors. So when it comes time to underwrite the bonds, I'm sitting on one side of the table, your side, the underwriter's sitting on the other side. And ideally there's not a huge fight, but occasionally there are, where you say to an underwriter, look, the market is 3 3/4%. Why are you at 4? And maybe you don't sell the bonds. Maybe you get a different underwriter. But that is sort of illustrates the changes that have been made to avoid that conflict of interest. But so what would happen is the underwriter will have $250 million, let's say, of bonds to sell. A big chunk of it will go to Franklin funds, Dreyfus funds, money managers, but a lot of it will go to individual investors. $5,000, $10,000, $50,000 lots. So there is that opportunity. Yeah.
Now, who determines the bond ratings? Is it an underwriter or?
No, there are actually two primary rating services in the United States, Moody's Investor Service and Standard & Poor's. Their criteria is very similar. They look at the rates, projected revenues, the history, the mix of users, whether there's a heavy concentration of a single user, and then determine most revenue bonds for this situation are probably in the A+, maybe AA range, depending on what the rates are how stressed the community is. You know, chances are bonds on the peninsula would be higher rated than bonds for our friends over in Coalinga. But, so.
Does the underwriter hire the rating from the rating service? Who pays for the rating service?
It's part of the bond financing cost, and the municipal and the underwriter jointly prepare and make the presentation to the rating agencies.
I was going to mention that when dealing with the public, it would be good to avoid the subtleties that we're discussing tonight, and maybe offer it in terms of, look, I've got a gallon of water here, and I'm going to sell it to you for cost, or you can buy it and I'm going to add 9 or 10%. Which would you like?
Right.
Because that's pretty easy to understand. But when you get into the subtleties of high finance, maybe the people
No, yeah, obviously when you, not to insult anyone's intelligence, but when you're doing a mass ballot measure marketing, you want to remember the phrase KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. And it's not a reflection on the public, but you don't want to give them a 5-page single-spaced document they have to weed their way through. You want to give them, a page that has a lot of white space and hits 4 or 5 key points.
Well, we probably do have a few individuals in this community that may be Wharton graduates.
No, there will be people that dissect every little bit.
But there's some, the vast majority of people, you would be way over their heads and you would lose them.
Yeah, you don't want to get talking about return on investment and corporate profits and internal financing versus external financing and cost of funds and all of that. So yeah, you want to keep it simple. Yeah.
Cal-Am has been very clear that should they have to sell this, they're going to make it as expensive as they possibly can for us to buy it. And one of their big arguments is that the legal procedure will go on forever and they'll cost off. How do we answer that question? Maybe be out of your field of expertise.
Well, no, as I say, people ask me often, are you a lawyer? And I say, no, but I play one on TV. You spend enough years in this business, you're close to being one. There will be litigation. It is not going to be 30 days of litigation. There will be cost to that litigation. Every eminent domain proceeding has a life of its own. Whether it's a year or 2 years or 6 months, a lot of that goes to not how deep the pockets are, but, how good the arguments are. So, yes, they will try to tie it up in court, and, they'll try and make it 10 years, but I think all you can do is say, other eminent domain actions typically take about X, and your eminent domain attorney will have far better knowledge of that than I do. And that's how you counter that argument.
When the value is set for Cal-Am property, do they take into account the stream of revenue of or fictitious interest rates from the corporate center and so on?
Well, it's interesting because it becomes a double-edged sword for Cal-Am. I would suspect, and again, I have not looked at their books, I do not have firsthand knowledge of this, I would suspect there are various charges, expenses, financing costs that the parent is charging to Cal-Am to minimize the profit that Cal-Am is showing from the project and to justify the rates they're demanding be paid. Well, The problem is, when you then get into eminent domain, you say, yeah, but we're not going to have all those costs. We're not going to pay 6% on our debt. We're going to pay 3 3/4. You know, we're not going to have O&M of this. Ours is going to be this much less. So it helps your argument because it shows you'll be able to charge lower rates. The court should not take into account, in other words, the court should not let Cal-Am go, wait. Let us restructure these financials to show you what our profit is, because that's why they ought to pay us $400 million instead of $250 million. So, you know, you should be paying the value of the asset, not, you know, future revenues and profits.
Well, but there is going to be an argument that the revenue stream is a valuable asset and therefore has, you know,
Has a value, yeah.
arguments and value.
They're going to make that argument. Now, whether the court buys it or not is, you know, really comes down to the arguments and case law that the eminent domain attorney can cite and draw on. And again, that is not my field of expertise.
So that revenue stream is valuable to us too,
Yeah, and
30 years.
yeah, and remember, providing water to the public, you know, is much like providing fire services and police services. You know, it is a necessity of, call it public safety if you want, you know.
Can I just do something that's simple, and I just got tapped on the shoulder. We are going to pass the hat around. One of the questions about making it simple, this was a chart that we developed, and it's got a couple errors in it. We're going to try to redo it to make it simpler. But just so you know, we're trying to divide Cal-Am's income stream into 4 categories. The blue is what they spend locally. It's about half, you can see. But there are going to be some minor changes here, and we're maybe a couple weeks away from having a better chart, an accurate chart, I should say. The green are things that support the services locally but are spent somewhere else. It's some engineering services out of Sacramento, it's the call center out of Illinois or Florida, their billing system, wherever that is, I think it's in Florida. We're going to have those costs. So what we've been able to find, and Eugene's one of the committee members, I don't see anyone else here right now. We have a committee of 5 people with some financial credentials who are looking at Cal-Am's reports. These numbers come from Cal-Am's reports to the PUC. And so the numbers that we're dealing with are Cal-Am's numbers. We just structure them in a way so that it's easier to understand. So this is all local expense, this is off-site expense, and then you get to the orange and the red. And we can identify the orange, which is their corporate taxes, which public agencies do not have. And then the other thing we don't have, public agencies don't have, is profit. So if you just look at this, we're looking at 25% or so of the total take that Cal-Am gets goes into their revenue stream that's not accounted for with any expenditures. We're calling that profit. They won't call it profit because they don't want to say we made 25%. They'll call it something else. But it goes back to your, about how do they move money through their system and then call it something else. Anyway, this is coming, and I want you to know that we're trying to simplify. I appreciate what you're saying. We haven't reduced it down to how much of a gallon. But anyway, we're headed that direction. I have another question, though, by the way.
Yes.
What's rated from Moody's or Standard & Poor's? Is it the agency that's buying or has it, or is it the bond issue itself?
Both. Generally, a public entity will have a bond rating. Then the individual bonds will have their own rating. So, for example, a general obligation bond issued by the Monterey Peninsula Water Management Board, let's say, is rated AA. Illustrative only, this is not fact-based. Revenue bonds issued by the Water Management Board, will be rated A+, half a grade below general obligation bonds. And the reason for that is they are not secured by ad valorem property taxes. They are not voter approved. So that's where you get into a slightly lower bond rating and therefore a slightly higher interest rate. Certificates of participation, depending on the essentiality of the project being financed, may be the same as revenue bonds or might be a little bit lower in terms of rating. So really there's both.
I have another question, but go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond a little bit to George's question. During the crash, where there was a problem with some kinds of bonds, but mostly lower rated bonds,
Yes.
is that the companies were paying for the rating, and they, of course, wanted a high rating, and some of the Moody's and some of these went along with that. They tried to make some regulation against that, so.
They've tried to clean that industry up a little bit.
I don't think that applies as much to municipal bonds.
Right, it was more corporate and that, and you know, it's much like, and my father told me this probably when I was 12, so it sticks in my mind. You know, everybody talks about how wonderful MAI appraisals are, and how they're the cream of the crop. And he said to me, "You know what MAI stands for, don't you?" I said, "No," and he goes, "Made as instructed." And invariably an appraiser, and if you've sold a house, you've probably experienced this, will come out, or if you bought a house, and the first thing the appraiser will say is, "What do you think it's worth?" You know, and then they try to get to justifying that number. You know, ideally they've cleaned that up a little bit, but I always take appraisals a little bit with a grain of salt, because they'll say, "Oh, you're doing a $200 million bond issue, you want it to appraise for 210 million, and darn if it doesn't come in at 212. It might actually be 295, but they're not going to say that. Now, eminent domain is a little different, because there you're not just supporting a bond issue, you're trying to determine, a real value of assets. So that's a little bit different.
I have 2 points that I'd like you to try to maybe clarify. One is the litigation question that came up a while ago, and I was thinking rather than listening.
It's always
But does the existing litigation, I mean, it's got to happen, existing litigation be considered in an eminent domain process, or is that totally internal to whatever that lawsuit is?
It can be factored in. It normally is separate. It isn't exactly like a bankruptcy proceeding. When a company declares bankruptcy, a bankruptcy court has extremely broad power, and they can actually adjudicate underlying lawsuits as part of their bankruptcy proceeding. That is not necessarily the case in eminent domain, because it goes to the nature of what the lawsuits may or may not be.
And I have one other question, but I'll do it later.
If somebody sues Cal-Am before the eminent domain takes place, will that reduce the cost?
It depends whether the suit has merit and what it might be happening, more. And in all my years, I think it's happened to me twice. The scarier scenario is somebody who's opposed to a project, either a new project or a public ownership, a day before you're selling the bonds or the bonds are supposed to close, files a lawsuit saying, the election was illegal, or, the eminent domain hearing was handled wrong or any number of things. As I said, that's only happened twice to me, and both times we were able to get them dismissed within 48 hours, so that's frivolous.
And this has to do with the CDO, which I know you're not all, as he said earlier today, not totally up to speed on the CDO. The CDO requires a water supply project. A bond requires a water supply project.
Yes.
So either way, whether CalAm goes forward or the purchase of CalAm goes forward with the district, either one will have to have, and CalAm does in its, its storage tank, I guess, a project. The Water Management District will also have to have a project if they issue a bond.
Yeah, you've got to be able to reasonably represent to the investors that these bonds will be paid off over the course of the 30 years. Well, in order to do that, you have to at least give some validity to the fact that there will be water for 30 years. Now maybe you don't have to have a water supply project if there is a demonstrable way to prove there is water or obtainable water for the 30 years. I assume that's not the case, which is why I say you'll need to identify a project. So, for that's one of the very good.
So we do 250 million on a bond to buy. Once we become an agency or a municipality, doesn't that open us up to a whole bunch of other funding sources, like state revolving funds?
Yeah, there are, and I use revenue bonds. There's obviously state revolving funds. The problem there is it requires a allocation, and there are some other funding sources.
But once you have a defined project,
yes,
and it's not only loans, but it's also grants.
yes,
that you can
exactly. Yeah, clean water grants or access grants, things like that, both federal and state. Yeah.
So I want to get back to this liability issue. There was an article in the paper yesterday about a few ratepayers that are, because of CalAm's mismanagement, were overcharged, and the fines, could potentially be in the tens of millions or higher. So let's, for the sake of argument, assume that happens. Does that put the public agency on the hook for that? I mean, it was CalAm's malfeasance before we acquired them. Aren't they responsible for their malfeasance before we acquired them for their mismanagement?
Yes. And chances are what would have to happen is those lawsuits would be settled from the proceeds of the sale.
Right, but it's up to CalAm or American Water. Or
whoever, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if there's it's much like if you're selling your house and somebody has placed a lien on the house, the buyer is not paying your lien. It is coming out of however much you think you sold your house for.
Thank you.
Now, I don't want to speak to what happens post-sale, but ideally, you could argue that that's not our malfeasance.
Would you just comment the way you did this afternoon, or what you comment this afternoon on how you, in a broad-based ballpark way, how you got the 250 million?
Yeah, I was driving down here today. Purchases of water systems have a factual historical basis of about $6,000 per connection. If you've got 39,000 meters here, and I sort of like 40,000 better because I can do the math in my head. If you've got 40,000 meters at $6,000 a meter, that's roughly $240,000 or $240 million. If you sit there and figure, maybe it's a little more, maybe it's a little less, maybe with fees and other things, you're looking at at probably a $250 million, bond issue or something. So that's, there is a factual rationale to the number, not necessarily factually specific or accurate to this purchase. But I wanted to have something for discussion purposes, and that seemed like the most logical number to use. I think if you took 250 million for 39,000 hookups, it is $6,410. Yes, and I didn't do that the way I did it earlier today.
I guess I wanted to add to what you said, because it makes sense. You said Cal-Am is going to try to get as much as they can. The public entity doesn't want to pay
Correct.
as much as they could. But then the judge is going to have his independent person, and then the judge that's going to rule on eminent domain, my understanding is going to make sure it's fair.
Yes.
To the public as fair to the
fair and equitable.
Yeah, fair and equitable, that's the term. So I'm trying to get everybody to understand is, whatever the number is, it should be fair and equitable as far as the person that is ruling on eminent domain.
Correct. And the decision at that point is, do we still want to proceed with taking it private or from private to public? You're going to do a ballot measure where you're going to make, or the Water Resource Board is going to make certain representations to the public. We're going out asking for approval of the purchase of the water system for the peninsula. We are assuming it will cost in the neighborhood of $250 million, which, given financing today, is about $30 a month for the public. That's going to be the factual basis that people use to make their yay or nay vote. We get through the eminent domain process, the court decides it's 400 million. I would assume the Water Management Board would then have a series of public hearings. They probably would not do another vote just because of how long a vote takes and cost and campaigns and that. But they would probably do a series of public hearings to get a feel for, does the public still support it at $45 a month as opposed to $30 a month? But, that would simply be prudent.
Now, is the court that decides on eminent domain, is that a final decision, or is there any kind of appeal that someone thinks they're a loser?
To be honest, I don't know. There is always appeal options from what I can understand now. I don't know the basis of appeal for eminent domain. But your attorney would be able to speak to that.
I've heard it's treated as final, but I haven't heard that question before.
Right. Certainly a final judgment is entered. That doesn't mean that you cannot appeal the decision often. But, yeah.
In evaluating the assets of Cal-Am, would that include all these projects that haven't been completed yet?
They most likely will, because by the time, think of this, you're talking about an election 14 months from now. You're probably talking about a final value determination. Let's guess a year after that. In a best case scenario, I would suspect within the 3 years, those projects will have been rolled into the rate structure and be part of the assets, good or bad.
So in essence, then, if we look at how much we're paying now,
it's going to be more.
oh, of course, but, saying we're paying $250, whatever it is on the chart that George shows.
Right.
But that's not going to be the buyout cost of what those
what that will be. And if we projected 3 years in advance, then we would have a more realistic.
Yeah, and I'm, obviously, as you get into the campaign, you know, how to present that and the factual basis for the numbers you use will become important. You know, because to the extent those projects have not come online and the cost of those projects rolled into the rate structure already, you're going to have to make certain assumptions which Cal-Am will counter in, you know, their campaign. Oh, no, it's not that much.
The one assumption we always can make is that everything Cal-Am does on its financing side can be refinanced on the public side at less cost.
Right.
We have that option. We may be running out of questions. Is there anyone else that's got something to go? Because we may be. All right, okay, go ahead.
One quick comment. But all the projects that Cal-Am is working on or could come up with in the next 3 years, we will pay for anyway.
Yeah,
Plus the profit.
yeah, it's just that you're going to pay for them less, in theory, than not.
And my second point is,
And
whatever.
hopefully the projects are necessary.
That's right. But whatever we pay a private entity, we would know we're paying the cost because we get to check the books.
Yes, yeah.
And that's what we keep forgetting. We keep talking about how much it costs, but right now, we're gonna pay the cost anyway.
Yeah.
But we don't know what the fees are to the parent company plus profit.
Yeah, there are different accounting standards and disclosure requirements for public entities over private entities. So, you know, you hope you can, you know, again, I'm not an accountant, much less a forensic accountant. But, you know, you certainly don't want to be trying to figure out where they're hiding fees and expenses.
But by different, you mean more transparent.
Yes.
To the public.
Yeah, clearly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that historically, the longer we're with Cal-Am, the more we'll pay for failed projects. That's important to consider. You know, at least we'll have a chance of doing our own thing if we buy it.
Yeah. I mean, remember the CPUC, not being an expert on this, I'll talk in generalities from what I understand, doesn't get into, was the project you did necessary or is it efficient? They get into, okay, it's costing you X, therefore you need your rates now to increase to cover what you were before plus X. And you know, so to that extent they have to justify the project. But nobody's going to say to them, why'd you do this project for 25 million when you could have done it for 15?
7.
Or whatever. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you very much, Roy. I appreciate it.